This one's called Cool Blue. Cool Blue in the opening episode, Z Card. When I graduated from college, I didn't know what to do with the rest of my life. I only knew what I didn't want to do, which was just about everything. The idea of doing anything, year after year, day after day, seemed like a fate worse than death. A living death, buried in a cubicle of carpet wool. I was willing to get dirty. I was willing to sweat. I was even willing to take on a little danger if absolutely necessary. Solder pipeline on the ocean floor. Paint suspension bridges. Clean lion cages. Bring it on, as long as it doesn't last for about more than a month, 2 the most. In college, I studied fiction. It was the only subject that made any sense to me. Teaching was out of the question. Who would ever subject themselves to that kind of abuse? Or so I reasoned. The only alternative seemed to be to write some fiction myself. So I thought perhaps I would live a story and record it, write it down, like Kerouac had or Ken Kesey had. And since my favorite authors had gone to sea, my very favorites, Herman Melville, Joseph Conrad, Jack London, to sea I decided to go too. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. When I got home from college, I literally grew up looking at the Ohio River. It was like only a couple few hundred yards in front of my house, and there was nothing in between except for railroad tracks and a couple of fields. The Coast Guard station was just a couple of miles upstream. And the only worthwhile field trip that I took when I was in graduate school was to this shipping agency in South Chicago, where I learned that sailors needed, in order to ship, they needed a Z card. It's like a passport that was issued by the Coast Guard. So I went to the Coast Guard station just up the road from where I grew up, and I swaggered into the station and sidled up to the counter. And I asked for the document by name. I said, I'd like to get a Z card, just to lend authenticity to the endeavor. The officer who was on duty was prepared, I suppose, for any question, but even that one surprised him. He was used to dealing with people who needed motorboat licenses for the Ohio River. Here I was, 1,000 miles from the coastline, asking for a shipping document to go to sea. He said to me, do you have a ship? No, I didn't have a ship. That's what I came for the Z card for. He said, well, you need a letter of intent to get a Z card. Got to get a shipping company to say they're going to hire you. I went to the Cincinnati Library and I consulted the telephone directory of New York City, and in the yellow pages I looked up shipping companies and began to write down addresses of companies. Boarded the Gray Dog. Boarded the Gray Dog. You know what the Gray Dog is, right? That's the Greyhound, yes, the Greyhound bus. Somebody knew who was, yes, good, Quentin. Boarded the Gray Dog and took my duffel bag. Yes, my dad's duffel bag from World War II. Took my dad's duffel bag, stuffed in there everything I thought I might need when I went to sea, and found a room in the Bowery. Where's the Bowery in New York? Anybody know? It's that southernmost tip of Manhattan. I took a room in the Bowery at the YMCA. I think I was paying $17 a night back in 1977, 74, 75. Paid $17. And the next morning, I had purchased a map of New York City, of Manhattan. I purchased a map, and I had plotted the addresses. I had plotted all the different shipping offices, and I made myself an itinerary, so I wouldn't have to go back and forth and zigzag all over. And I started as soon as I thought the offices would open, and I went from office to office. I wore my blue jeans, and I wore my t-shirt, and I had on work boots. I was ready to go to work right then and there, should they hire me. I walked into the first shipping office. The receptionist looked at me like I had landed from the moon. I don't think everybody in the place was wearing a shirt and tie. It was a shipping office in Manhattan. Do you know what I mean? I looked like I belonged on the wharf, on the dock, on the seafront, waterfront. I said to her, I'm trying to get a ship. She said, we don't do that kind of thing here. It's a shipping company. We don't do that kind of thing here. I got that same response at several offices that I went to. They looked at me as if I was some hayseed walking in from the barn with a sprig of hay in my teeth. Yeah, we don't do that kind of thing here. As if I'd ask them to tumble into a hay pile with me. One of them, though, did give me an invaluable tip. She said, try the unions. Holy smokes, I never thought about that. Try the unions. And as good fortune would have it, Julia, there was a union, a shipping union, in the Bowery. Not within walking distance of where I was staying, and walking distance of the Y. National Maritime Union, NMU. I recognized the building blocks before I got to it. Do you know why? It didn't have windows. It had portholes. It was a multi-story building with portholes. That's actually a famous piece of architecture. You can look it up online and see pictures of the building. Read about the architect. Went through the front entrance, and inside was an auditorium, more or less the dimensions of ours here at GHS, except the floor was level. It didn't slope down. There was a huge board at on the back wall. And if the ceiling was 2 stories high, it might have been 3 stories high and vaulted. The lights were recessed. Charnay, they twinkled dimly through the smoke like stars on a cloudy night. There was a bank of clouds of smoke that hovered over several card tables around which sat men that were old enough to be my grandfather in plaid shirts with long underwear, and they sat around the tables and they, pardon? Yeah, you know, they wear it underneath. Well, you wear long underwear on top too, right? You can have long underwear pants and you can have long underwear shirt. In fact, you need the shirt long before you need the bottoms. And they had them underneath their flannel shirts, and the flannel shirts had the sleeves rolled up, and they all needed a shave about 3 days before. And they were all sitting around these tables, and they were throwing dice and playing poker, and they were playing dominoes for money. And I don't think most of them even wanted to get a ship, not right away. They were basically, that's where they hung out. When they weren't on a ship, they hung out at the hiring hall. At the end of the wall, at the back wall, I could see this gridded board, much like the one I told you about in the previous story, only bigger. This was New York. It was the biggest. It was the biggest port at the time. And this board was pre-gridded with ship's name, and then you would write in the position sought, and then the destination of the ship, and the board was empty. There was a scaffold for a guy because the board was tall enough that the man who would write on it needed a scaffold to get to the highest lines. Nobody was on the scaffold. There was a lighted window on the side wall, and I could see a guy in there. So I figured he must be with the administration. I walked over to the window. He was a corpulent lout with a surly mug, and he was reading the newspaper. And I didn't want to disturb him, so I just stood there for a moment. Finally, I had to clear my throat. And he looked up. He didn't say, "Can I help you?" He said, "Yeah, what?" "Yeah, what?" I said, I'd like to get a ship. He said, "You got a Z card?" Oh, wait a minute. I can't get a Z card if I don't have a ship. And I can't get a ship if I don't have a Z card. This is like a novel I read, Catch-22, do you know what I mean? I couldn't break the system. It was nepotistic. Do you know what that means? What's nepotism? What is nepotism? Huh? What is that?
When you hire your friends and family.
Yeah, family especially, yes. Cronyism is where you hire your buddies, and nepotism is where you hire your relatives. Yeah, and if you had a dad who was in the Merchant Marine, you could get a card. If you had a grandfather in the Merchant Marine, you were going to get a card. If you had a father-in-law who was in the Merchant Marine, you were going to get a card. I didn't have anybody on the inside. And it took a little while for that to finally dawn on me, because I walked around New York like a fool for several days. And then finally I just realized I was going to have to go about this differently. So I went back to Cincinnati and went to see if I could get a job on the river. Now, I never wanted to be a river sailor, a deckhand on the river. It was too familiar. I knew what the opposite bank of the river looked like. It wasn't exotic enough. I had dreams. I wanted to go to exotic places. I wanted to quaff exotic beverages. I wanted to eat exotic foods, and I wanted to make love to exotic women. I was young. I sure didn't want to be on the Ohio, hardly even the Mississippi. But if I couldn't be Herman Melville, I'd have to be Mark Twain. And I went down to one of the river companies that had an office in downtown Cincinnati, appropriately named the Ohio River Company. They had an office in the Provident Tower on the 14th floor. Was modern as buildings went at the time. It was glass and steel, and the 14th floor was floor-to-ceiling glass almost all the way around. There was a mock-up, a little model of a towboat in a hermetically sealed glass. It was a towboat pushing a barge of coal. And the coal was shiny and dustless. And the deckhands, because they had little miniature deckhands on them, the deckhands were clean. They weren't dirty. They weren't sweating. Looked like the weather was perfect every single day of the year. It was the very boat I wanted to get on. I asked the receptionist if I could fill out an application to work on a towboat, and she gave me a clipboard with the application on it and the pen on a chain so I wouldn't steal it. And I filled out the application dutifully, honestly. And where it said level of education, grade of education completed, They didn't even have my number listed, so I wrote it in and circled it. That's right, I think it stopped somewhere around 12. I wrote in like a 17 and drew a circle around it. And then Mr. Endicott came out. He was personnel director, a kindly old man, white wispy hair, gold wire rims. He was comfortable. His white shirt was, his tie was loose and the sleeves of his white shirt were partially rolled up. He had a West Virginia twang because the office used to be in Huntington, West Virginia. He looked at my application and he said very friendly like, he said, "We'll give you a call, son, when we need you." And I assured him that I would be sitting by the phone. This is back in the old days when you couldn't take it with you. It wasn't in your pocket. It didn't vibrate, right? It was there, sitting there, and I was waiting for it to ring. I waited all week. Never rung. So I went back the following Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Endicott wasn't in. He was in a meeting. But the receptionist promised to tell him that I stopped by. He didn't call that week either. The following Monday, bright and early, 9 o'clock, there I was. Mr. Endicott was in another meeting. Didn't get to see him again. I went 7 straight Mondays. Armani, I went every Monday without missing, flawlessly at 9 o'clock. Never got to see him. The receptionist finally took pity on me. She said, "Go back and see him yourself. He's down the corridor, second door on the left." I walked back and his door was open. I just stood there. I didn't say anything. He might have felt my shadow on him. He was going through a stack of applications as thick as a Cincinnati telephone book. Going through a stack of applications. He looked up and recognized me. He might have felt guilty. He ran his fingers through his wispy hair and he said, "Go take the physical. If you pass it, you can have the job." I took the physical. I passed. I worked that job for 3 years and I wouldn't quit it. I wouldn't quit it until a better opportunity came up. It was just before Thanksgiving, and that was always the time. That was always the time that sailors, deckhands, people wanted to get off boats and be with their families. And Mr. Endicott had given me a call just prior to Thanksgiving. He said, the Ralph Plaguey, is going to New Orleans. You want to go? Well, man, I had no reason not to, and to ride the Plaguey to New Orleans, moreover, seemed like a real Christmas plum. When I climbed on the boat at Thanksgiving in Cincinnati, there were icicles, Willow, hanging from the splash pans. They're like 3 foot high that go around the bed of the barge to keep the water from sloshing over and into the coal bin. There were icicles that were like 3 feet long hanging from the edge of the splash pan down to the deck. But the further downstream we got, when we got on the Mississippi, the closer we got to New Orleans, the warmer the weather got. Long rides with nothing to do. It was great. No, it was just riding, making time, making money, going to New Orleans, which excited me enormously. When we got to New Orleans, it was 70 degrees. We made up the tow, bare-chested, in the sun. The guy who was the pilot of that boat, the captain, had a license from the end of the Mississippi all the way up to Pittsburgh. He was licensed to run all the Ohio and all the Mississippi. Consequently, the company was sending another boat south, but that pilot didn't have as much license. He couldn't go as far south. So We turned, what they called, turned that boat around. Oh, I don't know, we might have been up somewhere around Memphis, and we gave them our tow, and they gave us their tow, and we turned around and went back to New Orleans. We did that 2 or 3 times. I was running out of days. After 30 days, they've got to either find you a relief or start paying you overtime. They don't want to do that. Christmas was over. Some of the guys were ready to go back to work. I got a call that I was being relieved in Baton Rouge, 90 miles north of New Orleans. They give you a flight fare home and fare for to stay in a motel if you needed to overnight. You had meals paid. I spent the night. The next morning, instead of going to the airport, I cashed in my ticket and I hitchhiked from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. When I got there, I went to the payphone and I started calling tugboat companies. Second one I called, Cenac Towing. The guy answered the phone. He said, I asked him, I said, you got any jobs? He said, where are you? I said, I'm in New Orleans. He said, you know where Homa is? I said, no, but I'll find it. He said, well, if you get here, you got the job. There was no way I could get lost. Between New Orleans and Homa, there is nothing but a road. Everything else is bayou. If you get off the road, you're in the water. I hitchhiked down to Homa, Louisiana, and everybody was getting off the ship. Everybody wanted to be home for whatever holidays they could. They were short-handed. They were hiring warm bodies. They didn't care. I didn't have a Z card. I had no right to get on that ship, but they weren't asking any questions because they were hauling oil from offshore, like where we had the oil spill. That was one of those oil derricks out in the middle of the Gulf. That's what we were doing. We were going out and picking up a full barge, dropping off an empty, and bringing the full back into to the bayous and the refineries where that oil was being turned into gasoline. 10 days I worked on that tugboat. They were the most miserable 10 days of my life. It never got below freezing, but it hovered just above it. It was damp. It was cold. I was sick. Oh my goodness. You don't get super big seas in the Gulf, but in an 80-foot tugboat, 6-foot seas, that boat bobs like a cork. We made 10 days worth of trips, and when we got back in after the holidays were over, I was promptly fired. I was thrilled. It was in the cards. It was my destiny. I was always going to be fired.
So why they fired you?
Fired me for not being a regular. Do you know what I mean? They had the regulars back. And I went straight to the Coast Guard station in New Orleans. I went to the counter. The officer who was on duty asked me, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'd like a Z card." He said, "Do you have a ship?" I said, "Better than that." And I reached in my pocket, I pulled out my discharge, and I held it up in front of him and said, "I already had one. I already had one." And he filled out the paperwork, and the card was on its way. Z card, my friends. I showed you the document the other day. Thank you.